A young driver bought an old man's truck at an estate auction, and inside the dashboard, he found something that had been hidden there for 50 years. A wedding ring, brand new, never worn, and folded around the box, a jeweler's receipt dated March of 1974. When he went looking for the man who owned that truck, he found a story that an entire truck stop had watched for half a century, and not one of them had ever understood what they were looking at. Stay with me to the end of this one. The last 5 minutes are the reason I couldn't let this story go. Let me start with the auction. In the spring of 2026, a 27-year-old driver named Denny Aldis went to an estate auction in western Missouri with $4,000 and a dream that was older than he was. Denny wanted his own truck. He'd been driving for other people since he was 21, saving in an envelope taped under a drawer, and the envelope never grew fast enough, because envelopes never do. The truck that came up on the block that morning was a 1973 Peterbilt, 53 years old, and the moment it rolled into the light, every man at that auction went quiet, because it was perfect, not restored, kept. Original paint, deep forest green, waxed until it held the sky in it, chrome without a pit, an engine bay you could have served dinner in. The auctioneer said the previous owner had passed away that winter, that he'd owned this truck since it was new, and that in 53 years he had never once let anyone else drive it. The collectors were at a different auction that weekend. The farmers wanted newer. And so, at 9:40 in the morning, a broke 27-year-old with an envelope of small bills won a 53-year-old Peterbilt for less money than it was worth, and stood there shaking, because sometimes life just hands you the thing. Denny drove it home that same day, and that was when he started noticing the strange things. The first thing was the passenger seat. The driver's seat was worn the way 50 years of honest work wears a seat, shaped to one man's frame, the leather gone soft and dark. But the passenger seat looked like it had left the factory the week before. No wear, no cracks, no shape of any human being in it at all. 53 years on the road, and it was as if no one had ever sat there. Not once. The second thing was the radio. It was an old AM unit, original to the truck, and the tuning dial was frozen, not broken, frozen. Someone had carefully, deliberately fixed it in place, set forever on one station out of Kansas City. Denny looked the station up. It had been an easy listening station in the 70s. Love songs mostly. And the third thing was on the sun visor. Tucked under the band on the passenger side, a flower. Pressed flat, dried to paper, so old it had gone the color of weak tea. A little white flower, the kind that comes in funeral arrangements. A truck with no passenger, a radio that only played one station, and a 50-year-old flower. Denny told his wife it felt less like he'd bought a truck and more like he'd been handed something. He just didn't know what yet. He found out on the 9th day. There was a short in the dash, the gauge lights flickered, and Denny pulled the panel behind the instrument cluster to chase the wiring. And behind the factory panel, where there should have been nothing but harness and firewall, his flashlight found a second panel. Handmade, cut and fitted by someone patient, hinged with 2 small brass hinges, held shut with a little brass hook. It had been built to be invisible. It had been built by somebody who was good with his hands and wanted no one to ever find it. Denny unhooked it. Inside, resting in a cradle of soft cloth that had been glued in place so nothing would ever rattle, was a small velvet box. And inside the box was a wedding ring, a slim gold band with a modest stone, 50 years old and absolutely new. Never sized, never worn. Waiting. Folded underneath the box was a receipt. Hoffman & Sons Jewelers, Joplin, Missouri. March the 14th, 1974. Paid in full, and the amount on that receipt, Denny would later learn, was about 4 months of a young trucker's wages in 1974. At the bottom, in the jeweler's copper-plate hand, a line, for E. Whitlock, for Miss Clara June. Denny Aldis sat in the cab of his new old truck for a long time, holding a ring that had ridden behind that dashboard for half a century, and he understood 2 things at once. The first was that the frozen radio, the untouched seat, and the flower on the visor were not strange anymore. The second was that he could not just put the panel back and drive. Somebody had loved somebody in this truck, and Denny had to know the rest. Now, before I tell you what he found, let me ask you something, because this is the heart of the whole story. If you have ever had something you needed to say to someone, and the time to say it ran out, then this story is already yours. Subscribe if you believe some loves don't end just because life interrupts them. And tell me down in the comments, Who is the one person you wish you could have said one last thing to? I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the man who built that panel. The estate paperwork gave Denny the name Emmett Whitlock. 78 years old. Passed away quietly that winter. No wife. No children. The truck had been the whole estate. Denny started asking at the truck stops on the routes the old man had run, and he learned very quickly that everybody had known Emmett Whitlock, and nobody had known him at all. The cleanest truck on the interstate, they said. The quietest man at the counter. 50 years on the same routes, and never a crossword, never a ticket, never a story. He ate at the same diner every Sunday, in the same booth, always alone, and he tipped well, and he spoke gently, and he kept himself to himself so completely that after a while people stopped wondering. It was an old waitress named Marlis who gave Denny the first thread. She'd worked that diner for 40 years, and when Denny showed her the ring, she sat down slowly in the booth across from him, Emmett's booth, and she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The 14th of June. Denny said, "Ma'am?" "Every year," Marlis said. "The 14th of June. He'd wash that truck till it glowed. He'd come in here early, in a pressed shirt. The only day of the year you ever saw Emmett Whitlock in a pressed shirt. And he'd drink one coffee, and then he'd drive off somewhere, and he'd come back in the evening, and he'd look." She searched for it, emptied out. Every year. 50 years. Nobody ever asked where he went. You didn't ask Emmett things. He had a fence around him, that man. Politest fence you ever saw. She looked at the ring in the box. She said, "Clara June." That was the name. And when Denny nodded, Marlis put her hand over her mouth, because she was old enough, just barely old enough, to remember. Here is the story, the way Denny pieced it together from Marlis, from county records, from a newspaper archive, and finally from the one person still living who had known it whole. In 1972, Emmett Whitlock was 25 years old, with a brand new forest green Peterbilt he'd bet his whole future on, and a habit of eating at a certain diner in a certain small Missouri town, not because the food was better, but because of the waitress. Her name was Clara June Hastings. She was 23. Everyone who described her to Denny, 50 years later, described her the same way. She was the one who remembered things. Your kids' names. Your bad knee. How you took your coffee, forever, after telling her once. The whole town was a little in love with Clara June. Emmett Whitlock was entirely in love with her, and it took him 18 months of Tuesday meatloaf to find the courage to say one sentence that wasn't about the weather. They courted for a year, the old-fashioned word for the old-fashioned thing. Sunday drives in the Peterbilt, Clara in the passenger seat, her seat, with the radio on the Kansas City station that played the love songs. People remembered seeing them. The big green truck at the overlook, at the lake, at the edge of the fields, two silhouettes and a radio. In March of 1974, Emmett drove to Joplin and paid Hoffman and Sons 14 months of savings for a ring. He asked her at the overlook, on a Sunday, with the radio playing. She said yes before he finished the question. The wedding was set for the 17th of June, 1974, at the Baptist church, with the whole town invited, because you couldn't have kept the town away. On the 14th of June, 3 days before the wedding, Clara June drove over to her sister's place 2 towns away to try on the dress one last time. A storm came up out of the southwest that evening, the fast kind, the kind that county grew like corn. And on the way home, on a rain-blind county road, Clara June Hastings' little car left the pavement. She never made it home. 3 days before her wedding. She was 24 years old. I'm not going to dwell there, and neither did the people who told Denny this story, because the town learned a long time ago that the story isn't the storm. The story is what Emmett Whitlock did next, and what he did next was, at first, nothing at all that anyone could see. He didn't rage. He didn't leave. He didn't drink. He returned the tuxedo. He thanked the church. He stood at the funeral beside Clara's family, straight as a fence post, and he shook every hand in that town. And then he went home, and he took the ring, and he built a small wooden panel behind the dashboard of his truck, with 2 brass hinges and a brass hook, lined with soft cloth so it would never rattle. And he put the ring inside, and he closed it, where she would ride with him, every mile, every year, for the rest of his life. He fixed the radio dial on her station. He tucked a flower from her service under her visor. And he never, in 50 years, in 4 million miles, let another human being sit in the passenger seat of that truck. Drivers thought it was superstition. Loaders thought it was fussiness. It was neither. It was a reserved seat. Marlis had it right without knowing she had it. Every 14th of June, the day he lost her, 3 days short of the day he was supposed to keep her, Emmett Whitlock washed the truck, put on a pressed shirt, and drove to the cemetery 2 towns over. He did it at 26, and at 40, and at 60, and at 77. The last year, when the hospice people drove him and a nurse had to push the wheelchair to the graveside. 51 Junes. He never missed one. The whole interstate watched that man for half a century. The cleanest truck, the quietest counter, the empty seat, and never knew they were watching a marriage. It just never got its wedding day. There is one more person in this story, and she is the reason I had to tell it. Clara June had a little sister, Ruthie. She was 16 the year of the storm, and she is 74 now, and she still lives in that county. And when Denny Aldous knocked on her door with a velvet box in his hand, Ruthie Hastings Calloway knew what it was before he said a word. She had been at the Overlook the day her sister showed off that ring. She had helped pick the dress. She sat Denny down at her kitchen table, and she held the box, and she told him the parts nobody else alive could tell. How the whole family had begged Emmett, for years, to move on. Meet somebody. Live. And how Emmett would never argue. He'd just smile, that gentle fence post smile, and say the same thing every time. I am living. I'm just doing it with her. And then Ruthie told Denny the thing she had carried for 50 years. Her voice went very small. She said, 3 days before the accident, Clara and I were up late talking, the way sisters do before a wedding. And she got serious for a minute. She was never serious. And she said, Ruthie, if anything ever happens to me, you tell Emmett he has to love somebody else. You tell him I said so. Promise me. And I laughed at her, because who says that? 3 days before her wedding. Ruthie's hands were shaking around the box. And then it happened. And I was 16, and I was drowning, and I told myself I'd tell him at the funeral. And then at the funeral I couldn't. And then a year went by, and then 10, and the longer I didn't say it, the more impossible it got. Because how do you walk up to a man 50 years into his grief and hand him a message you were supposed to deliver in 1974? She looked up at Denny. She said, he kept his promise to her his whole life. And I never kept mine. He died not knowing she'd said it. Denny Aldous, 27 years old, sat at that table not knowing what a person says to that. But it turned out he didn't have to say anything. Because Ruthie stood up, and she got her coat, and she said, well, I'm 50 years late, but I know where they both are. Drive me. They took the Peterbilt. And for the first time in 52 years, somebody sat in Clara June's seat, her little sister, holding her ring, with the radio dial frozen on the old station, riding to the cemetery in the truck that had been faithful longer than most marriages last. And here is where I have to tell you the detail that finished me, the one Denny found out from the cemetery's own records when they got there. Emmett Whitlock was buried beside Clara June. Not near her. Beside her. Because in the summer of 1974, weeks after the funeral, 52 years before he'd needed, a 26-year-old Emmett had gone to that cemetery office and quietly purchased the plot next to hers. He had waited his entire life in line for that spot. The wedding was canceled. The vows never were. Ruthie stood over the 2 graves, the storm's sister and the faithful man, and she delivered her message, out loud, half a century late. She said, she told me to tell you to love somebody else, Emmett. That's what she wanted. I'm sorry I never said it. And then Ruthie was quiet a moment, and she looked at the 2 headstones side by side, and she laughed a little through the crying, and she said, but I guess you found the loophole, didn't you? You never did stop loving somebody. It was just always her. She left the message there, where it belonged. 50 years late, and, in the end, unnecessary, because some instructions, love just quietly overrules. Ruthie wouldn't keep the ring. Denny tried. He put the box in her hands at the kitchen table when he brought her home, and she held it a while, and then she gave it back, and she said the thing that tells you everything about that family. She said, that ring's never belonged to a hand, son. It belongs to the road. He built it a home in that dashboard, and it rode 4 million miles with him. You put it back where he kept it. Some loves get sold with the truck. That's just the freight you carry now. So that is what Denny Aldous did. The ring is back behind the dashboard of a 1973 Peterbilt, in a little wooden cradle with brass hinges, sealed the way Emmett built it, and the panel is closed, and if you didn't know, you would never know. The radio dial is still frozen on the Kansas City station. The little white flower is still under the visor. And to this day, no matter who's loading, no matter who needs a lift, nobody rides in the passenger seat. Denny's wife asked him about it exactly once, and when he told her the story, she never asked again. Now she calls it what it is. She calls it Clara's seat. And every year, on the 14th of June, a 53-year-old forest green Peterbilt gets washed until it holds the sky, and a young trucker in a pressed shirt drives it out to a small cemetery 2 towns over and parks it where 2 headstones sit closer together than headstones need to. He didn't know either of them. It doesn't matter. Some appointments come with the truck. The auctioneer that morning saw a 53-year-old rig in nice condition. Denny Aldis, 9 days later, found out what he'd really bought: a wedding that lasted 50 years without ever having a wedding day, a reserved seat, a Frozen song, a ring that stayed new because the promise stayed new. Some loves end when the person is gone, and some loves just build a little wooden box behind a dashboard and settle in for the long haul and ride. For Million Miles, Clara June. He drove every one of them with you. And he's not driving alone now.